in England, and he starts talking to a couple of Dutch, of all people, guys dressed in full SS uniform. It was just quite bizarre. You you wouldn't think, you know, as they said, oh, if we did this at home, we would be locked up. You know, why, if you were Dutch, in God's name, would you want to dress up in SS uniform? It makes no sense to me. But then again, lots of things make no sense to me. So,
you have a firm opinion on this?
Oh, I'm just trying to figure out whether it's illegal or not. But I don't have enough facts here to figure it out. Well, I've seen people dressed up, reenacting things. If you go to Cornwall Park, sometimes you see people out there with swords, fighting each other. That's quite amusing. I think this is a bit different because it's Nazis. But, you know, would some people be offended? Is offence enough to stop other people from doing things? Are they intending to be offensive? Are they trying to be intimidating?
It's that whole freedom of speech argument again, isn't it? You know,
if the two of you came across them in the countryside just going about their business, let's assume there was no interaction, you just saw them obviously wargaming, or whatever the word is, phrase is, would you care? Would you be offended?
Well, I'm not Jewish, you know. If I was Jewish, I might be offended.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Yeah.
well, you know, live and let live and all that, but, you know, I wouldn't be offended per se, but it just seems, the whole thing seems a bit silly. But
seeing as May was mentioning her busy time recently, a columnist in The Guardian today, worrying about robots stealing our jobs, how silly. The digital age will free us up not only for leisure activities but also to take on caring roles that can only be filled by humans. This was being said 30 years ago, of course, and now we work amazingly hard, some of us, if we have jobs.
And look, Elon Musk, if you become a multi-billionaire, then you have to work 120 hours a week.
Elon Musk, entrepreneur Ariana Huffington wrote him an open letter saying he needed a healthier work-life balance. He retorted that simply wasn't an option. In a tweet at 2:30 in the morning, he says he's under enormous stress, isn't seeing his children, worked straight through his birthday.
Of course he has to, doesn't he? It's called choices. We make choices. That's his choice.
Is that, even though you're Elon Musk, is that ever worth it?
to some people it might be. Their work might be their life. Or their life might be their work or whatever. Just, you know, depends what floats your boat, doesn't it?
It's interesting, though. It tells you a lot about his personality. He's just completely and utterly driven. It's very interesting when you do the psychological testing. You'll find people like him. They have the mindsets of often Olympians. I was talking to Barbara Kendall about it, and there are some people who are just like that. They were born that way. They were born in first gear, and they just can't quite get out of it. This guy's obviously there.
In terms of the placating remarks about how we're all going to have jobs but also much more leisure, does your future outlook tend towards the dystopian or the utopian before we go? Is it going to be like that, or are we going to have not as many jobs and still not much leisure?
Yeah, probably still not much leisure, I think. I think that's probably the way it's going to go. Because as you said, this was, you know, they were talking about this 30 or 40 years ago, that, you know, the future was going to be so much easier.
Now.
Because, by now, yes.
Well, you're talking to a lawyer. It's always jam side down. Dystopian for me.
May Chen, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Jam side up for you tomorrow, though, I think. And Alan Blackman, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you for your company, everybody. That's today's panel. We are back tomorrow, and Checkpoint with John Campbell follows.
Tō maira e hoa mai he kōrere, kei te haere, hei kaupapa, kei te karawhiua. Tonight on Checkpoint, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull survives the leadership challenge, but for how long? To what extent are feedlots the future of beef farming? We'll speak to Environment Minister David Parker about them. The government strips most public sector bosses of their performance bonuses. Residents in Ohope and New Plymouth pick up the pieces after two separate tornadoes last night. The Maori King says Tuku Morgan has undermined his office over claims of misspending. And how much more money will the government have to pay to fix Christchurch? EQC boss Sid Miller wouldn't tell us last night. Does the minister have the numbers tonight? All of that and more coming up after the news on RNZ.
RNZ News at 5. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Lei a taua tēnei. Stripping public service bosses of their performance bonuses is likely to save $4 million over about 3 years. The State Services Minister Chris Hipkins made the announcement on bonuses at Parliament this afternoon, the day after the government announced a freeze on MPs' pay. Here's our political reporter, Craig McCulloch.
The base salary for a public sector chief executive sits at roughly $400,000 on average. A performance bonus of 15% would bump it up by another $60,000. Mr Hipkins estimates scrapping that will save $4 million by the 2021 financial year. He says research shows performance pay is not an effective incentive. Rather, it actually disincentivises collaboration between senior leaders. The affected chief executives have all signed new employment contracts. From Parliament, Craig McCulloch.
Australia's Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has called for unity after surviving a leadership challenge from his Home Affairs and Immigration Minister Peter Dutton, 48 votes to 35. The narrow win sets the Turnbull government up for further instability and the possibility of another ballot before the next federal election. Mr Dutton has now resigned his cabinet positions and headed for the backbenches. And despite the threat of another challenge, Mr Turnbull says he wants his coalition government to be united.
I don't bear any grudge against Peter Dutton for having stood up and challenged me today, and I invited him, in fact, to continue in his position. It's really important that we put differences behind us and get on with our job.
Peter Dutton has stopped short of guaranteeing he won't challenge Malcolm Turnbull for the leadership again. A Christchurch couple will turn down the offer from the government for uninsured quake-damaged homes in the red zone. The government announced today that it will pay $12 million to 103 homeowners over the next few weeks. Bexley resident Ray Francis says they won't accept the offer as it's based on property valuations made in 2007 and 2008. She says they're in no rush to move anytime soon.
The first earthquake, we only got one little wee crack in the wall. That was no problem. We have got a wee few cracks, but, you know, if we could stay here, we could just do it up. But it's not too bad anyway. We don't have leaks. We don't have. It's a lovely, warm, sunny house, and there's no worries about it.
Ray Francis says they've been looking at houses and would struggle to find one in their price range, even if they decided to take the offer. Parts of the North Island, still cleaning up after being battered by tornadoes last night, are in for more foul weather. 2 tornadoes struck within about 30 minutes of each other, one in Bay of Plenty and one in Taranaki. Met Service forecaster April Clark says parts of the west coast of the North Island could get more tornadoes tonight.
We do have a moderate risk of thunderstorms, and with that, hail to 5 to 10 millimetres and heavy rain to 10 to 15 millimetres, but also the possibility of small tornadoes this evening for western coast from northern Wellington right up into Waikato.
April Clark says the coast is more likely to see tornadoes if they do hit again. The forecast for Bay of Plenty, where Ohope was hit by a tornado, is for showers which may be heavy and thundery. A Whakatane District Council spokesperson says it's still supporting property owners in the area. The police and security guards are keeping empty properties safe, and locals are being asked to avoid walking near damaged buildings because of glass and other debris. The trial of 5 men for the abduction and rape of a woman in Kapiti has begun, with the prosecution saying she was forced and the defence maintaining there was consent. Shay Holland, Terry Thompson, Lewis Craig, Jeffrey Troon and Jordan Fitinui appeared in the High Court at Wellington today on a combined 65 charges. The Crown Prosecutor Sally Carter told the court today in her opening statement the complainant was taken by car to the house of one of the men in Parapara-Umu in October 2016.
They then took her into a bedroom at that house, and in that bedroom she was forced to participate in various sexual acts. Once they'd finished doing that, you'll hear that the complainant was taken from the address by them in a car and left on the side of the road.
Prosecutor Sally Carter. The defence says the complainant wasn't held against her will and any sexual acts that took place were consensual. 2 serious car crashes in Auckland have added to Auckland's heavy peak hour traffic woes. Emergency services were called to a crash involving 3 cars and a van on State Highway 16 near Kumeu at 3:20. The police say 2 people suffered minor injuries. The route between Old North Road and Old Railway Road in Kumeu is closed and detours are in place. Earlier today, another serious crash blocked all northbound lanes on State Highway 1 near Ornewell Road for more than an hour. All traffic has been diverted to State Highway 16 and further congestion is still expected. The serious crash unit is investigating. There will be no talk about winning streaks in the All Blacks camp ahead of this weekend's second Bledisloe Cup test in Auckland. Unbeaten at Eden Park for 24 years, the All Blacks have 17 straight wins in the ground against Australia over the past 32 years and haven't lost to the Wallabies in New Zealand since 2001. While records like that bring added expectation, the All Blacks assistant coach Ian Foster says they have a simple way of dealing with it.
Don't talk about it. You know, like this is a game that we know we're going to be playing a wounded beast. We know that if we don't play to the levels we need to play and get better and better, that we'll be in trouble, and we've got no better evidence than last year. We know if we play well and do what we do, there's a great feeling in the stadium and the boys love that, but we've got to earn that feeling. Ian Foster. The sprint legend Usain Bolt has started his A-League stint with the Gosford-based Central Coast side in Australia. Bolt's indefinite training period began with a 15-minute passing drill in front of almost 100-strong media contingent. Bolt says he's out of his comfort zone and isn't setting himself any targets and is ready to play any position. He says he received offers from clubs in France and Spain, but they weren't in the top division and he would have had to learn a new language. The New Zealand men's softball team leaves for the Czech Republic tonight to compete in the Intercontinental Cup, where they will play the hosts along with Japan, Argentina, the United States and Denmark. The World Cup will be played in Prague next year.
Fire. There's the smoke and then there's the dust. There's a few rattlesnakes around and seeing the odd evidence of where the Mr. Bear's gone to the toilet. We're just seeing all sorts of different wildlife. Earthquake.
Hundreds of deaths and tens of thousands of homes that have been destroyed or too badly damaged to be entered. So, you know, it's a very dire situation for everyone on Lombok. Tornado.
You can be sitting down like I was, about to have my tea, everything's okay, and next minute, bang, your roof's gone.
Raising the Roof, Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espinel, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, Waste Not, Want Not, making bin liners from advertising banners bound for the tip. And after 10, playwright, novelist, screenwriter and lawyer Whiti Hiriaka discusses her latest book. Join me, Lynn Freeman, and for Catherine Ryan on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from the Met Service to midnight tomorrow. The northern half of the North Island from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Periods of rain or showers, sometimes heavy with hail and possible thunderstorms, easing for a time tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, long fine spells but a few showers in the afternoons and evenings. Whanganui and Taihape to Wellington, also Wairarapa. Showers, some heavy with hail and possible thunderstorms, easing tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland. Showers, some heavy with hail and possible thunderstorms, clearing Nelson and Marlborough tonight and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Canterbury, North and Central Otago and Dunedin. Mainly fine but isolated showers today, mostly about the Canterbury foothills. Clutha, Southland and Fiordland. A few showers turning to rain at times tomorrow, and Chatham Islands, showers clearing today, mainly fine tomorrow.
Susana Leatawa, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being with us on Checkpoint. It's 9 minutes past 5. We begin tonight in Australia, where Malcolm Turnbull is still Prime Minister, but only just. He beat Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton by 48 votes to 35, a 13-vote margin. But Dutton's bid for leadership was a scratch effort, hastily organised and lacking its own momentum. Next time, there won't be one, says Malcolm Turnbull, who's selling his victory as full and final, calling for unity as a Liberal-led government beset by infighting attempts to win the next election, scheduled for the first half of next year, likely to now be earlier. All of this in the context of a striking fact: the last Australian Prime Minister to see out a full term from start to finish was John Howard a decade ago. Here's the ABC's Alexandra Beach.
here we go again. As ministers filed into the Liberal Party room meeting this morning, those loyal to Malcolm Turnbull issued final warnings about the dangers of disunity. Among them, the Energy Minister, Josh Frydenberg.
To be a good government, you do need a good leader, and Malcolm Turnbull is that. One thing history teaches us is that there's a high transactional cost from changing leaders. Labor's seen that, we've seen that.
Also hoping his colleagues had learnt the lessons of history was Senior Cabinet Minister Christopher Pyne, speaking on Sky News.
I think people would be horrified if the government changed leader again. We've had Rudd to Gillard, Gillard to Rudd, Rudd to Abbott, Abbott to Turnbull. I think the Australian public would throw up their hands and say, you guys in Canberra are playing games, putting your own self-interest first.
But this escalated quickly, and the spill took many MPs by surprise. One of those who had a hand in bringing things to this point is Tony Abbott. But this morning he was keeping mum.
Good morning, Mr Abbott. How are you?
Look, I'm fine, but there's a party room today, so nothing to say here.
Do you think this was a capitulation of convenience by Malcolm Turnbull?
It's we've got a party room on today, and that's where... Oopsie daisy, right there.
There's been speculation since last week that Peter Dutton would challenge. Mr Turnbull spilled the leadership today in a bid to bring tensions to a head. It wasn't until the meeting was underway that we learnt Mr Dutton was throwing his hat in the ring. Before long, the party's whip, Nola Marino, emerged to announce the result.
Oh, good morning. The Prime Minister called a ballot in the Liberal Party room, and I conducted a ballot with my whips. The result of that ballot was Malcolm Turnbull was elected leader of the Liberal Party by a margin of 48 votes to 35, with Peter Dutton as the other candidate.
Julie Bishop was returned unopposed as Deputy Leader. Ms Marino says the Prime Minister's now keen to return to business as usual.
This was conducted by way of precedent, and he thanked his colleagues for their support, and we will get on with the business now of governing in the interests of all Australians.
That will be tough. Malcolm Turnbull's won the day, but perhaps not the war. This was far from a resounding victory. Peter Dutton's now just 8 votes short of claiming the Prime Ministership. Malcolm Turnbull's credibility as leader certainly has been dealt a massive blow. And the loyalty of Conservative ministers like Peter Dutton had until now been a vital factor ensuring his survival as Prime Minister. As Christopher Pyne pointed out this morning, this sort of thing won't help the government at the upcoming election, which is expected to be held early next year.
Our best chance to win is stability. If there's a leadership spill, it'll be our 6th in 10 years. In the previous 50 years, there were 4 leadership spills. So this instability, this constant revolving door of leaders, is not in the best interest of the country, and I think the public would react to it very negatively.
But leadership speculation tends to have a way of gaining momentum. Peter Dutton has quit his role in the cabinet, and more frontbenchers are expected to follow him to the backbench. Given the numbers today, it's likely Mr Dutton will have another crack. The real question is when.
Yes, indeed. That's something we'll discuss with the Deputy Political Editor of Sky News later in Checkpoint. That report from the ABC's Alexandra Breach. Taranaki is bracing for another evening of terrible weather, possibly bringing more tornadoes after being roughed up by one last night. The forecast slightly better further north, inland in the Bay, across the island really, in the Bay of Plenty, where Auckland was also hit by a tornado last night, only about half an hour after New Plymouth, and both towns' locals are pitching in to help each other clean up. Laura Dooney reports.
The Surf and Sand Holiday Park Conference Centre in Auckland was one of 3 buildings hit hardest in the Bay of Plenty when a tornado tore its way from the ocean onto land around 6 o'clock last night. General Manager Mark Inman describes the damage.
It has, ripped it in half and spread it 500 metres down the road. So, she was going to have a significant impact in the near future, but like anything, we will rebuild and carry on.
Mr Inman says the clean-up is already well underway.
Mate, we have had the most amazing support from the Hopi community. We've had the Lions, we've had the Golf Club, we've had local builders, we've had plumbers, we've had your general community member all arrive in the droves. We've had probably 50 people arrive this morning, and they've worked on chainsaws and building gloves, picking up trees, the works, and the place is just about cleaned up. It's just amazing.
A dangerous building notice has been put on the centre, meaning conferences and weddings will have to be moved somewhere else. About half an hour before Auckland was hit, New Plymouth was in a different tornado's firing line. Trev was cooking dinner when it hit.
I was bloody cooking the old buttered chicken actually, and heard a bang and saw stuff flying through there, and then all of a sudden just a massive bloody gust of wind and hail just bashed the house, and then power went out and it was all over in a matter of probably seconds really. Yeah, wandered out through the house and the manhole was dislodged and looked up through that and could see sky.
He says it's lucky the wind hit late in the day. There's a school nearby and he thinks kids could have been seriously hurt or even killed. Trev reckons it will take about a week to fix his roof, part of which was ripped off in the wind.
Obviously a lot of re-roofing and exterior cladding damage at this stage, and yeah, sort of mainly, I say superficial, but a lot of roof structure, framing's gone with the iron, so yeah, it's probably extensive I suppose at the end of the day, but it's not the whole roof, but we'll ascertain things once we get up there and have a bit of a look around.
Nearby resident Vanessa says the neighbours have been wonderful, pitching in to help clean up.
It's been awesome. We've helped each other out and what have you, and we've got people coming in the minute to help pack up what needs to be packed up, and then it's just a waiting game. We're going to get the insurance people out hopefully, but we're just one of 30 or 40 and we're probably not even the worst, so we'll just wait our turn. There's people out there that'll be softer than us, so we'll just wait in line and they'll get to us when they can get to us. We're okay, that's the main thing.
Met Service forecaster April Clark says the weather's not clearing up in Taranaki anytime soon.
We do have a moderate risk of thunderstorms, and with that, hail to 5 to 10 millimetres and heavy rain to 10 to 15 millimetres, but also the possibility of small tornadoes this evening for western coast from northern Wellington right up into Waikato.
Ms Clark says there's less chance of a tornado hitting this evening than yesterday. Up and across in Auckland, residents cleaning up debris are doing so in showers that could become heavy and thundery. For Checkpoint, call Laura Dooney, Tēnei.
And if you are getting a bashing from the weather, we'd love to hear from you. Text us 2101. 17 minutes past 5, you're with Checkpoint on RNZ. The government has stripped most public sector bosses of their performance bonuses. The State Services Minister, Chris Hipkins, has announced he's axing the potential for those chief executives to receive bonuses of up to 15%. Here's our political reporter, Craig McCulloch.
Yesterday, it was MPs who took a hit to their pay packet. Today, it's public sector bosses. This is a double whammy PR offensive.
It's symbolic, and I think the symbolism is important. Because
the 1-2 sucker punch is meant to send a message at a time of strikes and pay negotiations. Those at the top of the public service are paid too much compared to those at the bottom. The State Services Minister, Chris Hipkins, announcing today an end to performance pay for public CEOs.
We want to see some downward pressure at the top end of the public service, and I think that's reflected in today's announcement.
The base salary for a public sector boss sits at roughly $400,000 on average. A performance bonus of 15% would bump that up by another $60,000. The government estimates that scrapping it will save about $4 million by the 2021 financial year.
The people who go into those senior roles are imbued with a spirit of public service. It's inherent in the name of the public service. So I don't think they are expecting to be paid salaries that are significantly ahead of the market.
The State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes, sets most of the public sector bosses' pay and has been trying to rein it in since taking over in 2016. And the Public Service Association's spokesperson, Glenn Barclay, says it's the right move.
We support efforts to restrain chief executive pay.
The government is no fan of performance pay. It says the evidence shows it's not an effective incentive, that it actually disincentivises collaboration between senior leaders. Mr Barclay wants the government to go further and scrap performance pay right across the board.
The pay systems that apply to our members in the public service are confusing, they lack transparency, they don't support teamwork. They just have to go.
A cynic might say it's a populist move, paired with the restraints around politicians' pay, a move more about perception than actual savings. It's certainly likely to find broad support from the public.
I really think it's a good move to do because it's all about the trust in government, and when you at the same time have a difficult message that other people don't get a pay raise, it just doesn't look good if they get those kinds of bonuses.
It's a lot of money. So I don't know if they deserve that much money for not really doing anything.
I think chief executives should have some incentive, but maybe not to that level though.
Legislation is also in train to crack down on Crown entities like the Super Fund, which won't be affected by this change. Their boards will soon need permission from the State Services Commissioner to give their chief executives a pay rise. Atu iti whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Craig McCulloch.
5:20 exactly. The Maori King has finally responded to those explosive claims criticising his leadership and his office at his annual Koronehana event in Narawa Wahia. King Tuhetia said he's saddened that a few people want to undermine his office and ultimately the kingitanga movement itself. This comes a week after his former advisor, Tuku Roirangi Morgan, sent a searing email slamming the King and his chief advisor, Rangi Whakaruru, for misspending. Our Māori news correspondent, Lee Marama McLaughlin, reports.
A plea for people to unite in the familiar waiata Tu Tira Mai Ngā Iwi, sung before the meeting house Mahinarangi. As the rain cleared at Turanga Waiwai Marae, Kingi Tuheitia spoke.
Today I stand before you with a great deal of joy, having reached 160 years of the establishment of the kingitanga.
This time last year, the King's former advisor, Tuku Roirangi Morgan, was standing by his side as he gave his Koronehana speech. But this year, Mr Morgan was nowhere to be seen and was on the King's radar for a different reason.
It is my duty to be straight on matters that affect the state of the kingitanga. You expect no less from me. Our ancestors created the kingitanga to foster unity and to help our people resist colonial repression and to oppose the further loss of our land. I'm sad that there are few people within us that wish to publicly undermine my office and therefore the kingitanga.
King Tuheitia is referring to an email Mr Morgan sent a week ago, calling the King a puppet who's manipulated by his chief advisor, Rangi Whakaruru. He claimed Mr Whakaruru is paid a high salary, took out a large loan and drives an expensive car, all paid for by the King's Ururangi Trust. While not acknowledging the claims specifically, the King urged his people to unite.
I want to secure the stability of the kingitanga so that my family and my successors no longer have to face external, evasive, demeaning actions that diminish the mana of the kingitanga.
All morning, countless iwi leaders and religious figures paid tribute to King Tuheitia. The event was live-streamed on the Kingitanga's Facebook page after the King banned media from the celebrations following coverage of Mr Morgan's claims. The Serious Fraud Office is now investigating the trust. Kingitanga supporter Deborah Peace says she wasn't concerned the King didn't get into specifics today.
It's not an easy job to be the King, and if he chose to, then yes, then he should have, and if he chose not to, which he didn't, then that's fine. That's his decision. But I think that maybe he should address it at some stage.
Hinerangi Pene spoke in Te Reo Māori, saying his speech was sad.
Ahua pauri, ki aia, ki te iwi o Waikato, ahua pauri mō rātou.
Today marks the end of 5 days of festivities for the 12th anniversary of the King's coronation. His final words today acknowledged the people who run the Koronehana every year, and a defiant haka ensued. Sending a clear message that the kingitanga is here to stay. Mo te hōtaka o Te Ahi Pō, ko Lee Marama McLaughlin tēnei.
It's coming up to 24 minutes past 5 in a moving ceremony at Auckland Airport this morning. 27 New Zealand soldiers and one child finally came home after lying for decades in cemeteries in Malaysia and Singapore. The servicemen died on active duty between 1955 and 1971 in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand and Vietnam. The 3-month-old baby boy was the child of a soldier who died of an illness while in Malaysia. The repatriation process has taken more than half a century, but today the long wait for family members came to an end, and our Veteran Affairs reporter Andrew McRae was at the ceremony.
The chartered Air New Zealand 787 coming to a stop outside one of the airline's large hangars after its flight from Kuala Lumpur. Once the cargo holds were open, slowly one by one, The caskets came out and were each carried by 6 Defence Force pallbearers and rested on casket trolleys until all 28 were on the tarmac. Then en masse, soldiers, sailors and airmen and women carried the coffins into the hangar through a guard of honour and past dignitaries including the Prime Minister. Once inside, a private service was held away from the media. Jacinda Ardern says it was a moving ceremony.
To have the return of so many of the men, including a 3-month-old infant who all passed during the period that New Zealanders were serving us abroad in Asia. To see them returned home and to see their families welcome them home was incredibly moving.
The Prime Minister says in the period 1955 to 71 there were inconsistencies in this country's policy on repatriation.
That was something that this government didn't want to tolerate. We wanted that opportunity to open to those families who have today seen the return of their family members after so many decades, and I think it's only right that they had that same opportunity.
Jacinda Ardern met with family members, and there's a clear message from today's ceremony.
That every single time we deploy our people abroad, there's a huge responsibility that comes with that, and that we have a responsibility, their family members, to make sure that we show them the gratitude for the service that they give, regardless of when and where they served.
There are a number of servicemen who died overseas between 1955 and 71 and are still buried offshore. The Minister of Defence, Ron Mark, says decisions on their repatriation are entirely in the hands of their families.
It's entirely up to them as to whether or not they bring their loved ones home. Some have chosen specifically not to. That's their decision.
Group Captain Carl Nixon heads Te Aoraki, the project to bring the service personnel home. He says it's taken a year of meticulous planning to get to the point of starting to exhume the remains and repatriate them.
Parades like this, as you can see, don't happen easily, and that's really taken about 3 or 4 months to pull together with our partner Air New Zealand and also all the other backroom people that have helped us put this together.
Group Captain Nixon's very pleased with how the entire process has gone.
Very, very proud of the team up in Malaysia, the disinterment team. They did a fantastic job. And today, every sailor, soldier and airman was out there. I was very, very proud of them. I think New Zealand should be as well.
Following the private service inside the hangar, the caskets were taken outside with full military pomp and ceremony and placed in a fleet of 28 hearses. As they slowly drove away in convoy, they did so through an impressive haka by members of the Defence Force. 4 more servicemen are still to be repatriated, 2 sailors from the United Kingdom next month and a sailor and soldier from South Korea in October. In Auckland for Checkpoint, Ko Andrew McRae-Tene.
You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up on the program, the future of feedlots. We raised the issue last night. Lots and lots and lots of feedback to it. Environment Minister David Parker is going to join us live after business with Nona. Also, hundreds of special education staff strike that before 6. And how much more money will the government have to pay to fix Christchurch? Last night we asked EQC. Tonight we will ask the Minister that before 6 too. We'd love your feedback. Text us 2101 or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Don't forget we are, of course, on Twitter and Facebook. This is historic because the headlines are never early ever, but we want to fit both David Parker and Megan Woods in. So Susanna, the floor is yours.
The government is putting the brakes on the growth rate of chief executive pay in the public service to save $4 million in the next 3 years. State Services Minister Chris Hipkins says he will remove performance bonuses, limit pay settings and appoint new CEOs on lower salaries. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern yesterday announced a freeze on all MP salaries and allowances for a year while it reviewed the way their salaries are calculated. The Australian Prime Minister is calling for unity after he came close to being toppled by his Home Affairs Minister in a leadership spill today. Malcolm Turnbull won the vote in his Liberal Party caucus 48 votes to Peter Dutton's 35. But there's speculation Mr Dutton, who's now resigned, will have another go for the backbenchers before long. A resident in Christchurch's Bexley suburb says she will refuse the government's offer for uninsured quake-damaged homes in the red zone. She says the figures are based on property values from 2008. She says she and her husband would struggle to find a house in their price range, even if they decided to accept the offer. More foul weather is on the way for parts of the North Island, cleaning up after last night's storms and tornadoes. Met Service says parts of the west coast of the North Island could get more tornadoes tonight. There's rain, hail and a moderate risk of thunderstorms possible. And the trial of 5 men for the abduction and rape of a woman in Kapiti has begun in the High Court at Wellington. The Crown Prosecutor Sally Carter told the court today the complainant was taken by car to the house of one of the men in Paraparaumu in October 2016. Those are the headlines. Our next news and sport update is at 6.
Which is still 29 minutes away. Go and have a lie down, Susanna. Thank you very much indeed. Let's turn to business news now with Nona Peltier on the other side of me in the studio. Hi, Nona.
Hello.
We should say the weather so far so good. It's not pleasant, but no tornadoes or repeat of last night's activities.
That's right.
Which is good. Rainy days have delivered mixed results for companies' bottom lines, though. What impact did it have on? What impact did the weather have on Mercury?
Well, Mercury is a large Auckland-based company. They had a lot of rain in their hydro catchment areas, and so that churned up some very large profits for the company. Their net profit rose 27%, which is, fairly good. That's in the 12 months ended June to $234 million. And there were some one-time costs in there and some changes with interest and so on. But bottom line, it was a pretty good result as a result of that weather. And they're forecasting, no pun intended there, an underlying profit, which is going to be slightly less than last year, just because they're not counting on that fickle weather, as they say. So coming up...
It ain't fickle in Auckland, it just rains. There's nothing fickle about it.
Well,
it's entirely
it rains, but it rained more than usual.
Right.
Because, I mean, they're expecting to generate about 4,200 gigawatt hours in the coming year, and that compares with 4,947. So that's quite a lot more in the year just ended. And the difference there was, they're forecasting $515 million, and that's pretty good.
So I'm going to be facetious here. You just reach across, you roll up your papers and slap me with them. But so when it rains heavily,
yes,
rain being the raw material that drives...
Yes, hydro.
Right. We don't get discounts for the ready availability of the raw material from Mercury.
Sure. Well, it does... No, just a second here, because spot hydro, the consumer price, is based on availability and demand. It's a real supply and demand thing. So if it's a very cold winter's day and there's not a lot of generation around, you're going to pay more because the supply demand, right? It's really a market thing based on spot prices, and of course who your retailer is. And one of the things that Mercury was saying was that there was a lot of competition for retail customers. It's a very competitive industry. You can shop around for better power. You can go online and see whether or not you're getting the best deal for the kind of use that you've got. So, yeah.
Right, so Mercury did nicely out of the rain. Comvita, though, they didn't like the weather, right?
No, the bees didn't like it much at all.
No.
In fact, they warned that their harvest in January, February, March, that weather wasn't ideal for the harvest, and that's cost them 2 years in a row, but they're betting that they're going to be lucky third time because it doesn't usually rain that much. The weather's not usually that bad 3 years in a row. So they're kind of hoping for better days ahead. Their net profit was $8.2 million, and that was at the bottom end of its forecast. So
year on year down? Yeah,
down 16% from the year before. So not a great result for them. And, it showed up in the markets. Their share price fell just under 1%. That's 5 cents down to $5.65. And Mercury, on the hand, was a little bit down slightly. Well, of course, it's not going to be as good a result, right? Because that's what they're forecasting. Just a half a cent, though, to $3.40 and a half cent.
Right. So barely moved at all, right?
Yes.
What else happened on the markets today, Arnona?
Well, we reached another record high, John. Yeah, our own top 50 index rose a shade under 7 points, so that's not a lot, but hey, it's on the upside, right? To 9,116. And our dollar is trading at 66.6 US cents. 90.5 Australian and 51.9 pence.
Nona Peltier, thank you very much indeed. We appreciate it. Nona, we're waiting for David Parker.
He's phoning. Do you want to talk about some other things?
Well, we're going to go to something else. But I know you could film, Nona, too. You're a wonderful person. David Parker's calling in, but let's go to something before that. Hundreds of special education staff took to the streets today to publicise their case for better pay and more staff. The strike action involved 900 specialist workers around the country, including psychologists, language therapists and early intervention teachers. Lois Williams spoke to some of those demonstrating in Whangarei.
They're sometimes called the invisibles, the specialists called in to fix broken children and those with learning or behavioural problems that could derail their young lives. But today they were highly visible and audible, with placards and banners in the Cameron Street Mall, and bright hats with helpful labels like early intervention teacher. The message is that there are not enough of them to help all the kids who urgently need help, especially in Northland. Psychologist Andrew Eberle says the squeeze went on learning support staff in 2008.
We were under a cap, and so for 10 years we weren't able to hire anybody extra because we weren't considered frontline staff. And so our workloads doubled during that time.
Andrew Eberle says to compound the problem, staff vacancies were left unfilled while the causes of childhood trauma, like poverty and parental drug use, have soared.
We got a problem here where we're getting a lot of dislocation from Auckland, people coming up and buying houses. This is having a major impact on us because you got transiency exponentialized because people are being shoved out of homes because the home's just being sold and there's no place for them to go.
Mr Eberle, who's 62, says he's not unhappy with his pay. At $86,000, he's at the top of the salary range. But he says the starting salaries of less than $50,000 are too low to attract new recruits. And most learning support staff, like early intervention teacher Sharon Ketko, have a postgraduate qualification and years of experience.
I actually started off in early childhood as a teacher, and I trained in 1985 originally. I have since gone on to train in primary school as a teacher and worked there.
Getting some support there.
We are, it's wonderful. We've had a lot of support today, it's been fantastic.
Speech and language therapist Bev Jackson says too few staff means children are waiting too long for the help they need. She says 5-year-olds are arriving at school with language skills of 2-year-olds, and if that's not tackled early enough, it can have lifelong impacts.
Unless we can get in and address it quickly, it actually has long-term effects. If you look at the statistics for youth justice, there's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of students and even people that go into prison who have got some form of language issue, dyslexia, or some form of learning issue. And, you know, we really don't want people to have to go down that road. We want to help them before that.
Sharon Ketko says the ministry is doing its best to recruit special education staff from overseas.
And that is a huge concern for us, especially in the north and Taitokoro, where we really would love to have more staff who are fluent in te reo and can actually come with that understanding, that knowledge of whānau, the cultural knowledge here, and we are thin on the ground for that too, although the ministry does work very hard to try and attract those people.
The president of the Tai Tokerau Principals Federation, Pat Newman, was out visiting the picket line this morning to support the strike action. He says he gets a pretty good service from learning support these days, possibly because he's been so vocal about its shortcomings in recent years. But he says Northland children are still waiting 12 months for a fetal alcohol disorder assessment, and that's just one measure of the pressure on the service and its overloaded staff.
The people that we're talking about, and this is what the public needs to understand, could probably earn almost double what they do in private industry, and that's why we haven't got them. And these people are doing it because they actually care about kids, and we need more and more and more of them.
Learning support staff have rejected the government's offer of a 2% pay rise now and a further 2% in March, saying their jobs are worth more than that. In Whangarei for Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
21 minutes to 6. We want to visit now revisit a story from last night about the biggest beef feedlot farm in New Zealand. For those of you who weren't with us last night, feedlot farming is American-style intensive grain-fed beef farming. Cattle bunched together for months at a time at the end of their lives. They've been on grain previously so they can be fattened up faster than they otherwise would be. Sorry, they've been on grass previously than they otherwise would be if they stayed on grass. The biggest one in the country by far is the Ansco-owned five-star beef farm in Ashburton, which has consent to farm 19,000 cattle on less than 1 square kilometre. The farm is not new, it's been there since 1991. But we're talking about it now because it represents a style of farming that some groups are worried is going to become more common in New Zealand. Last night we heard from animal welfare group SAFE and from Fish and Game, who are both asking the Environment Minister David Parker to ban feedlot farming before it becomes commonplace because of animal welfare and, in the Minister's case, environmental concerns. David Parker is on the line now, I think. Thanks for being with us, Minister, and thank you for waiting 3 or 4 minutes to get on air.
No problem at all.
Nice to have you with us. What do you make of the sort of feedlot farming we saw on Checkpoint last night?
Well, I haven't seen in person the one near Ashburton, but I have seen in person a number of smaller but nonetheless problematic feedlots in the Hawke's Bay region. I described them a couple of years ago as battery beef lots, because they really do look like the beef equivalent of chicken. And I have a problem with the environmental effects of some of them. At least some of them, and I've been in discussions with the Hawke's Bay Regional Council about those.
So what is your position as Minister about controls in terms of the environmental impact of this kind of intensive beef farming?
Well, some of the ones that I've seen, and I've seen photos of them, and indeed I've seen them after rain events when there's puddles everywhere, there's not a blade of grass to be seen. And there's no doubt that when you have a rain event, the livestock effluent and the nutrient from the food residues has only one place to go, and that's into rivers, streams, or two places. The alternative is into the aquifer. And I struggle to see how some of them are legal. I know that there's some controversy in the Hawke's Bay recently about that with some other news that I've seen, and I know that the Regional Council have themselves written to me asking for some national rules that apply to beef lots throughout the land. They think that's the way to go.
The fact is the horse has bolted to a certain extent. This Ansco farm has been there since 1991.
Yeah, well, I'm not really in a position to comment on the Ansco one. I do think that if you've got these intensive forms of farming with lots of nutrient, that you actually need to be collecting the effluent rather than letting it run into the rivers and aquifers. I'm not really qualified to comment on the animal welfare issues, which I accept are a concern for some people. But in respect of the effects on rivers, regional councils have had the full array of tools since the Resource Management Act was passed back in 1991 to actually deal with these issues. Sadly, the rules in some areas are not adequate. I'm not saying that's true in respect of Ashburton, by the way. I just don't know.
No, and nor do we. And in fact, we're going to talk to Ansco and in fact visit the facility and talk to them about what they are doing with the runoff, with the effluent, with the shit, for want of a better word. The Ministry of the Environment, our land report from April, has once again listed the issues here. Agricultural intensification, increased erosion, degradation of soil and water quality, loss of soil biodiversity, especially true for intensive farming areas on flat to rolling lands. It says intensification leads to soil quality, erosion.
Soil compaction.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yep.
absolutely.
Yep.
So why are we even having this discussion now? Either this sort of farming is acceptable with various caveats around it in terms of nutrient and runoff disposal, or it is not acceptable at all. In other words, isn't it time for some architecture, some clarity around the terms under which this farming can take place?
Yes, it is. I think it's a great sadness that people seem to accept that you need the criminal laws need to be enforced and various other laws, but some people seem to think that environmental laws are nice to have rather than laws that should be adhered to. And I certainly think that some of these beef feedlot environmental practices are poor. I struggle to see how they're legal. I don't think it's fair for regional councils to say, over to you, central government, when they've had the authority to deal with this. Nonetheless, that is the reality, and as a consequence, we are left with having to deal with it, and I will.
And how will you?
We have it in a work program to develop some national guidance that could we haven't taken a final decision as to the form of it, but the choices include having a national environment standard, which is effectively a rule imposed from on high that all regional councils have to apply, and it could be applied at a farm level through compulsory farm environment plans that have to apply the national environment standard. That would be one way you could do it.
What would be another way of doing it, particularly in the context of operations that are up and running and have been, in this case, for 27 years?
Well, again, I won't comment on that one because I actually don't know that.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the Hawke's Bay ones I have seen, I'm happy to say, are environmentally unsound. And, I published photos in the lead up to the election.
Sorry, can I just interrupt there because the line was a bit muffled? Yeah. You're saying they are environmentally unsound?
Some of those in the Hawke's Bay undoubtedly are, in my view, and I've published photos on that in the lead up to the election.
So why are they still operating?
Well, they haven't been properly policed by the regional councils, and that means that central government has to step in with some national direction to bind regional councils, and we intend to do that.
Okay. And when do you think that will be done by?
I think our draft legal instrument will be promulgated for consultation by the first quarter of next year. That's already on our work plan, and as I say, there has been a change in the political makeup of the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. I think the area had a bit of a fright as a consequence of the Havelock North water scare. Although it was disconnected from this sort of thing, it sort of raised public consciousness of the issue. And I think the Regional Council themselves know that more needs to be done, and they want central government assistance to do it.
And you're saying the central government is going to provide that assistance, and potentially within the next 12 months or so?
Yes.
David Parker, will you go and visit that Ansco farm in Ashburton?
Well, if I don't, my officials will. But there's a responsible regional council down there, Environment Canterbury, and they've had their problems in the distant past, but they've been a pretty well run regional council in recent years. So I would be surprised if it's not already under some system of management through the regional council.
David Parker, Environment Minister, joining us live. Thank you very much indeed. An overwhelming amount of feedback from you on this last night. We asked Ansco itself, which owns the 5-star beef farm, feedlot farm in Ashburton, for an interview again today. We really do want to hear from them. Once again, they declined, so we contacted the former general manager of the farm. He said he was happy to be interviewed, but requested permission from Ansco. Ansco wouldn't give him permission to speak to us, but said a spokesperson would be available to talk to us on Thursday. Some people are saying, well, where's the Ansco side of the story, and aren't Ansco policing all of these kinds of things? We absolutely want to talk to Ansco about this, and we are hoping to do so on Thursday, and we have a promise that that will indeed happen. It's 30 minutes to 6. How much money does the government believe it may still have to pay out in Christchurch? We asked EQC that last night. Tonight we ask the Minister. In a fortnight's time, it's 8 years to the day since the first Christchurch earthquake. And as anyone who lives in Christchurch or who listens to Checkpoint knows, some insurance claims are still in dispute, dodgy repairs are still being discovered, and previously undiscovered damage is being found. There are on-solds, there are re-repairs, and it's all money. How much money? We'll answer that in a moment, but one lasting claim pool appears to have finally been settled today, or close to it. The quake outcasts, people who were uninsured when the earthquakes hit, who'd lost access to their land, but who'd missed out on the previous government's red zone offer. The appeal court ruled this was unlawful. There weren't many such cases left. 16 had taken and won a class action. The remaining 103 will be paid out a total of $12 million, although we hear at least one of them isn't happy with that. In essence, Megan Woods told me, the Minister, the appeal court decision set a precedent the government is now going to follow.
So the 16 claimants that took that class action were settled prior to the last election, but there was the remaining situation for the 103 people that hadn't been part of the class actions. This is one of the difficult legacies of the earthquakes that I'm really determined that we fix so that we can give people hope and they can get back on with their lives.
And the offer is rateable value, right?
Yes, it's 100% of the 2007-8 valuation. So that's the same offer that was given to insured homes in the residential red zone.
Gosh, isn't it lovely to have something concrete to deal with? You have an absolute and known number of homeowners. You have an absolute and known value to deal with.
It is. Knowns are always easier to deal with than unknown unknowns.
Yeah. Can we go to the unknowns? And I know you're expecting this question line, but what do you think the extent of the unknowns are? What are you now budgeting for in terms of, I guess, two things? One, out of scope, and that's work that damage that just simply wasn't noticed first time round. And two, remedial, which is damage that wasn't adequately repaired first time round. What do you think the extent of your future exposure is, ballpark?
So what we are is that we're tracking within the envelope of what we'd expect. Now, as you know, that earlier this year that I asked Treasury to go away and do some work on that, and this certainly isn't a concrete figure of a known number of claimants, but it's a very broad range. It goes from 125 million through to 1.1 billion. So it's a very large spread in terms of what the depending on different moving parts of it are. But that is what we're seeing is the potential liability for the Crown. And I think what people have to remember is that there is no closure with EQC, that as problems emerge, that people can come back and ask for re-repairs or to have their home looked at, and that's what we're certainly seeing happen this year.
So at the moment you're seeing an upper limit of just over $1 billion.
That's right.
And what is that figure made up of?
Well, that's looking at all the different moving parts, right through from the rate of re-repairs coming through in terms of different rates of those coming through based on what we're seeing now to what would be potential worst-case scenario. It's also looking at things like the on-sold issue. It's looking at a range of the different moving parts of what we know to be the insurance jigsaw puzzle here in Christchurch.
Okay, so the last time we spoke in April about the re-repairs, that was about $270 million at the time, wasn't it?
That's right.
So we are potentially looking at a figure 4 times greater than that, all up? That's not just re-repairs?
No, and I think that's important. That's not just re-repairs. So that would be a range of other factors coming into place in terms of new liabilities that came on outside of the scope of what we'd classify as the kind of failed repairs, the failure to adequately meet the scopes of work. It would be a whole range of issues that would come into there. So that's a broader category than re-repairs.
And I know we're dealing at the upper limit, but it does. And in fact, I was just looking at Southern Response, who provide an insurance liability evaluation, and the most recent one says, and I quote, there has been a high level of new overcap reporting, and it goes on to say future new overcaps will predominantly emerge from the continuing flow of new remedial issues. In other words, the pile's getting bigger rather than smaller, isn't it?
And look, I think that with Southern Response, that what we actually have in place is a good system now for them to have a good line of sight into EQC in terms of what is coming.
But I guess what we're talking to here is the remedial issues and the growth of them.
Yeah, and I guess that is one of the frustrations for everyone, that a re-repair can be something really small that can be easily fixed, or it can take things over cap. And that's why Treasury has come back with such a big range. While I find the situation frustrating, I don't find that number that Treasury has come back to me with frustrating, because I think it reflects the situation in which we're dealing with. And what we have to do is systematically work through each of these issues, which is what we've been doing. One of which, the first things, was actually making sure we've got enough people on the ground at EQC that we can be dealing with these claims as they come through. Because some of them aren't a huge liability for the Crown. It might be a very simple fix. And it's certainly not the kind of upper limit of what Treasury may have been modelling in that figure, and can be fixed relatively simply. And the sooner that we can process those claims, the sooner that we can get a clearer picture for the Crown around what the liability is. So, and that's why the fact that we've doubled the number of claims managers at EQC over the recent months is really important, not only for the claimants and for them getting on with their lives, but also for us as the Crown, working on behalf of the taxpayer, having a clear line of sight into what the liability is.
Okay, if it is somewhere in the region of $1 billion, how much money do you have in the Disaster Relief Fund at the moment? It's heading towards $200 million, isn't it?
That's right, and as you know, and as we've talked about before, that the Crown Guarantee kicks in at that point.
Which means the Crown is going to be liable for the difference between the $200 million that exists in the EQC fund and the total cost of these new remedial and extra claims.
Yeah, and I mean, as you know, that's a range that I've just talked to you about. It ranges from $125 million up to $1.1 billion. Obviously, $1.1 billion is the outer limit.
Absolutely, but it's not going to be $125 million, is it? There's no chance of that. I mean, you've got $270 million of re-repairs already.
That's additional. on top of. So that's in terms of what the additional liability may be. So it's important to know that is a range that Treasury has given us. That is the worst case scenario in terms of what the Crown liability may be, but it's also important to remember the bottom end as well as the top end. And probably, you and I can probably guess that it's probably somewhere in between those two numbers.
Have you got the money?
We have to have the money. This is a statutory obligation that exists between the people of New Zealand and the government through the earthquake, through the EQC Act.
Sorry, that wasn't a very good question by me, because of course you've got the money. It is a statutory obligation. I guess the question is, what are you setting aside for it? What's being written into the budget? What is the figure that you are saying to Grant Robertson, hell, we're going to need this?
Well, I guess one of the other things that Treasury has come back with their upper limit, that of course isn't in one financial year. And one of the other things that Treasury came back around that number is they don't know over what time period that would kick in. So it's not about saying we need all this in one budget, that there was money set aside in the last budget, as we've talked about previously, because we know the Crown guarantee is going to be called on in this financial year. And that has been worked through between EQC and Treasury, and that money is there. And that will be an iterative process that will happen between EQC and Treasury. One of the other changes that we've made since you and I last spoke is that Grant Robertson and I have got a bit more Treasury resource to work with EQC so that we can keep an eye on these things and we can get real-time reporting, as it were, on what those numbers are looking like and have a really good line of sight, because as you also know and we've talked about previously, I don't think there was enough clarity around where some of those things were tracking.
Minister, you've been able to give us, it's a huge spread, the figure, but you've been able to give us pretty good intelligence on what the projections, the estimates are from Treasury and what the government's potential future exposure looks like in the context of the Disaster Relief Fund, which is depleted and which means the Crown's books are going to be exposed to this. Now, I asked Sid Miller exactly these questions yesterday, and he told me that these figures didn't exist or he didn't know what they were. Is he running interference on behalf of the government there? Does he not know this information? If not, why not? Why were you able to tell me this today and he wasn't able to tell me this yesterday?
Look, this is advice I get as the responsible minister. That Sid is the CEO of EQC, is responsible for running EQC and making sure those practices in place. My job as minister, working with the Minister of Finance, is to ensure that we've got the government end of things sewn up. This isn't a case of the government running interference. I meet with Sid weekly. I have a good dialogue with him about the number of claims that are coming in, and that is information I need to feed in. This information I've given you is actually my job to be able to tell you that that's not for the CEO of EQC to tell you. No, in terms of what the government has set aside for those things, that is my responsibility as the responsible minister, and it is one that I will always take seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're not on the ground. EQC are. I mean, and a lot of this is work that the original scopes missed, and a lot of this is work that EQC was part of the home repair program, which wasn't adequately done. In other words, EQC must be funneling up. They're your eyes and ears on the ground. They are the Earthquake Commission.
Oh, absolutely. And I meet with EQC and with Sid every week, and with the Sid and the Chair every fortnight. And we talk about how many claims have been settled, how many claims have come in. Treasury are also at that meeting, because precisely as you identified, John, they are the eyes and ears on the ground, and that we need to be making sure that we've got a good line of sight into that information as it comes through. And this is something that I've insisted on as the minister when I became the minister, so that we can be making sure that we've got that really integrated approach between Treasury and between EQC. What I've asked EQC to get on and do is to settle people's claims.
Thanks, Minister. Just before you go, speaking of inadequate scopes and botched repairs and the Canterbury Home Repair Program, are you suing Fletcher's?
No, we're not suing Fletcher's at this point.
At this point?
We're not suing Fletcher's at this point. I mean, as I've talked to you before, is that, of course, it would be irresponsible for us to not look broadly around where liabilities may lie.
So there is still the possibility that the Crown will sue Fletchers?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that as we've talked about before, that I have sought advice on where liability lies.
And you're still waiting for that advice?
No, I've got that advice, but there's a range of moving parts, as we've also talked about before. At the moment, my top priority is settling people's claims.
Megan Woods talking to us earlier this afternoon. Lots of feedback coming in on that and on our interview with EQC last night, saying how come EQC weren't able to give you the figures tonight and the Minister was. We'll ask EQC that the next time we talk to them, although they are broader figures. In terms of the outcasts, the Quake outcasts, a few people asking why is it the government has to pay for uninsured properties? Surely that means you don't have to insure your properties. The government will fork out if there's another earthquake. Martin asked that, and Martin, lots of people are asking that, so I'm not picking on you. This is a completely unique situation because a whole area of land was red zoned. So the people couldn't get back to their land. They couldn't use it. They weren't allowed to use it. That's why this is exceptional. It doesn't mean that every old bugger who doesn't have an insurance claim when there's an earthquake is going to get paid out by the government. It simply means that when the government compulsorily requires your land or says you can't return to it, they pay you.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, ko Susana Leia tawa tēnei. The Environment Minister David Parker says he struggles to see how some beef feedlots are legal. The animal welfare group SAFE and Fish and Game are asking the Minister to ban feedlot farming before it becomes commonplace because of animal welfare and environmental concerns. Mr Parker says some feedlots are environmentally unsound and have not been properly monitored by local authorities. He says the government intends to step in with some national direction to bind regional councils. Extra police have been brought in to help hunt down the people who shot dead a 27-year-old man in Whanganui today. The police were called just before 10 o'clock to Puriri Street in Castle Cliff, where the man was killed. Detective Inspector Ross Mackay says extra police have been brought in from Taranaki and the Manawatu to help local officers track down those responsible. Mr Mackay says the offenders and victim were known to each other and the attack was not random. He says he doesn't believe there is any risk to the public. He says the police also understand the parties were involved with gangs, but would not say if that had anything to do with the shooting. The Public Service Association is applauding the end of performance bonuses for public sector bosses and hopes it will go further. The government has scrapped the bonuses of up to 15% for public chief executives in an effort to slow the growth of their salaries. The association's spokesperson Glenn Barclay says he'd like to see performance pay dumped for all public servants.
The pay systems that apply to our members in the public service are confusing, they lack transparency, they don't support teamwork, they just have to go.
Glenn Barclay says he supports efforts to restrain massive pay packets for those at the top of the public service. The Foreign Affairs Minister says it's too early to say whether the resignation of the Australian Home Affairs and Immigration Minister Peter Dutton will have any effect on Trans-Tasman policy. Winston Peters is on his way to Canberra, where he will meet his Australian counterpart Julie Bishop and the Deputy Prime Minister. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
Mr Dutton was unsuccessful in his bid to oust the Liberal Party leader and the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull in a leadership vote this morning. Both Mr Peters and the Justice Minister Andrew Little have been critical of Mr Dutton's handling of deportation policies. While Mr Peters says it would be churlish for him to raise the vote on his visit, he says what were looking to be slightly iffy Trans-Tasman meetings are now back on solid ground. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says Mr Dutton's resignation won't have an impact on the issues the government raises across the ditch. From Parliament, Joe Moyer.
Malcolm Turnbull has called on his Liberal Party to back him or risk losing the next election. Donald Trump says he's concerned he may face perjury charges if he gives statements under oath to the investigation into Russian collusion in his election victory. Speaking to Reuters news agency, the US President has admitted he fears any discrepancy in his statements could be used against him. The BBC's Peter Bowles reports.
Donald Trump tells Reuters if he wanted to, he could run the investigation into whether there was collusion between his 2016 election campaign and Russia. So far, he says, he hasn't chosen to be involved in the inquiry, which is being run by the special counsel Robert Mueller. The president has repeatedly called the investigation a witch hunt. He says he's hesitant about agreeing to an interview with federal prosecutors in case they're trying to lay a perjury trap. Specifically, he's concerned that investigators could compare his statements with those of others who've already testified, such as James Comey, the former FBI director.
Peter Bowles reporting. A Christchurch couple will turn down the offer from the government for uninsured quake-damaged homes in the red zone. The government announced today that it will pay $12 million to 103 homeowners over the next few weeks. Bexley resident Ray Francis says they won't accept the offer as it's based on property valuations made in 2007 and 2008. She says their house didn't suffer much damage during the quake, so they're quite happy to stay where they are. Mrs Francis says they've been looking at houses and would struggle to find one in their price range, even if they decided to take the offer. It's 6:04. Maori attending a criminal justice summit want more say on reforms of the prison system. More than half of the people in jail are Maori, and the Corrections Minister Kelvin Davis says Maori need to lead the way in reforming the justice system. Maori at the conference in Porirua support that stance. Hine Wirangi Kohu Morgan, who works in a prison, says the system is broken and the healing of prisoners should be led by Māori. State Highway 16 in West Auckland is now open following a serious crash this afternoon. The crash caused part of the highway in Kumu between Old North Road and Old Railway Road to close. The police say 2 people suffered minor injuries. In sports news, the Black Ferns don't want to dwell on the frustrations of the Sydney warm-up blunder as they prepare for the second rugby test against the Australian women's side at Eden Park on Saturday night. Unlike their male counterparts, the World Champions weren't allowed to warm up on the main field in front of spectators. Coach Glenn Moore says they're yet to confirm the warm-up situation for this weekend's game in Auckland, but as far as he's concerned, it's the least of his worries.
It's always frustrating at the moment, but things happen at left field at late stages, and that's part of what we've got to learn to deal with, and we dealt with that at the time, and that's parked and moved on, and other people will deal with that in the background. I've been in situations before with New Zealand teams where we've been heading to a game and a bus has broken down and you're arriving with 10 minutes to warm up, so things happen.
Glenn Moore. Meanwhile, Wallabies hooker Tatafu Polota now has launched a fierce defence of Michael Chaker following calls for the Wallabies coach to be axed after their first up Bledisloe Cup loss. Chaker's 49-test reign following the weekend's 38-13 loss to the All Blacks has been questioned in the Australian media, but Polota now is adamant Chaker should remain in the role, saying it was the players rather than the coach who need to go under the microscope. And the world number 1, Simona Halep, has withdrawn from the US final tennis open tune-up event with an Achilles injury. The French Open champion says she needs time to recover for the year's final Grand Slam after 2 weeks of competitive matches. That's the news.
Kia ora, Paul Brennan in for Brian Crump on Nights Tonight on RNZ National. This evening our Māori news correspondent Lee Marama McLaughlin is in to talk about what's going on in Te Ao Māori, the big story, the King's letter, and how things played out at the coronation anniversary. Also, more science with Tuesday's Science Pundit. We've got the sampler, Nick Bollinger, another window on the world, and of course the Tuesday feature. Join me tonight on Nights after 7.
This thunderstorm that came through this afternoon was quite a meaty one. There were huge lightning bolts and then thunderclaps, and it shook my place at home later on this afternoon and sent the 7-year-old running for her cuddly toys.
That's Lately with Karen Hay, 10 p.m. weeknights on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. The northern half of the North Island from Taranaki and Taupo northwards, including Bay of Plenty. Periods of rain or showers, sometimes heavy with hail and possible thunderstorms, easing for a time tomorrow morning. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, long fine spells, but a few showers in the afternoons and evenings. Whanganui and Taihape to Wellington, also wide at upper. Showers, some heavy with hail, possible thunderstorms, easing tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, showers, some heavy with hail and possible thunderstorms, clearing Nelson and Marlborough tonight and elsewhere tomorrow morning. Canterbury, North and Central Otago and Dunedin, mainly fine but isolated showers today, mostly about the Canterbury foothills. For Clutha, Southland and Fiordland, a few showers turning to rain at times tomorrow. The Chatham Islands, showers clearing today, mainly fine tomorrow. It's 8 minutes past 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Susanna. And thanks everyone for being with us. The Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has survived the leadership challenge, but for how long? Mr Turnbull defeated Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton by 48 votes to 35, meaning he'll remain leader of the Liberal Party, but also that there are 38 MPs in his caucus who want him gone. With the Liberals failing miserably to keep a lid on the party's internal dissent, its poll ratings have fallen sharply, even up against the Labour Party led by Bill Shorten, not wildly popular himself. Even so, Peter Dutton had said he wasn't considering a leadership challenge, and then, as Sky News Deputy Political Editor Karen Gilbert told me, it became clear Mr Dutton had been doing the numbers overnight.
He was indeed, and I spoke to one of his supporters prior to the vote. They thought he might get up around 40. He needed a little bit more than that. He needed 43 to be in a victorious position. But the problem is now, John, because he had 35 votes, the question is, can Malcolm Turnbull continue with such a large number of his own party thinking that he should move on?
Yes, he won, but it's not a resounding mandate by any stretch of the imagination, is it?
No, it's not. And for the Labor Party, it's the best of both worlds because the uncertainty continues. There wasn't a clear result either way. The speculation now, will Turnbull think about a snap election to bring some certainty to the situation? To be honest, from a national interest perspective, there's a very strong argument for that to happen, that one way or another, the Australian people hopefully can get some certainty by going to the ballot box. But there's no guarantee that'll happen anytime soon.
No, and that tired old phrase of politics about turkeys and early Christmas, right? I mean, that's what is Turnbull staring at if he goes to the polls early?
Well, that's right. But what's he staring at if he doesn't go to the polls? Another challenge potentially, and with the support leaking away from him to a potential second challenge from Dutton. Look, I don't know how this plays out. History would suggest that there'll be another challenge, and that the challenger then generally gets the momentum of that initially strong vote. However, we don't know because this is a party that's riven with ideological division right now, John, so it's very, very hard to predict how this plays out.
There's two things I'm fascinated by. One, and you said this is a party riven by ideological division. Where does Dutton stand on the spectrum? We're very coloured by his treatment of New Zealanders and by his attitude towards the people in Nauru and all that kind of stuff. So it has to be said he's not fondly regarded from the side of the Tasman, but where is he in the spectrum of that party?
He's very conservative. He's seen as a representative of the conservative wing of the party, and that's where his support came today. And you're right, he's a hardliner. He's a hardliner on immigration. I think there's a sense that if he were to win the job, that he would slash immigration rates, that he would go very hard on that as a political issue. So I think your assessment of him is one that's shared by many across this country as well.
And that brings us back to his challenge. It doesn't look like it was well whipped. It doesn't look like it was well organised. It looks like he was working overnight to get the numbers. So what are you suggesting, that if he has a better orchestrated from the backbench second challenge, this is a guy in with a real chance of toppling Turnbull?
Well, as I said, history would suggest that once a Prime Minister has had a large number, 35, it's not a majority, but still it's quite a significant percentage of the party room. Once that happens, history would suggest that others then waver, they balk. But this is a unique situation. You've got a party so divided, as we said, on issues, but you've also got a party divided on personality. And I'm not convinced that he will get a flood of extra votes over coming days. So there's a lot of uncertainty. As I said, for Labor opposition, it's the best of both worlds because they continue to look like the adults in the room.
Gosh, it's fascinating business, Australian politics. One final question, and it's not me being a cheeky bloody Kiwi, but why can't you buggers manage to get a Prime Minister who can go full term?
Yeah, I know. I wish. I had the pleasure of interviewing your former Prime Minister John Key, who he served for a number of terms, and I tell you what, that stability that Mr. Key presided over, and now Prime Minister Ardern, I mean, we can only dream of it at the moment, to be honest, John.
Sky News Deputy Political Editor Kieran Gilbert speaking to us a short time ago, in fact earlier this afternoon. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters is in Australia to meet with his counterpart, Liberals Deputy Leader Julie Bishop. Our political reporter Joe Moyer caught up with Mr Peters on his way to the airport to board his flight to Canberra and asked him what Peter Dutton's resignation as a minister, of course, would mean for New Zealand.
We don't know what the outcome will be in terms of replacement or any policy changes, so it's a wait-and-see situation.
What do you make of a backbench that now has Barnaby Joyce, Tony Abbott and Peter Dutton sitting on it?
Well, again, that's for Mr Turnbull and the Liberal Party to work out.
Do you think Mr Turnbull's safe in that position?
Well, first of all, he won. It wasn't a split decision, so to speak. And given that, I think no one survived 3 years. In the last 4 prime ministers alone, 2 were the same. I suppose the best we can hope for is some stability in the Australian political scene.
You've obviously been in politics for a long time. Do you think that majority is comfortable for someone in his position?
Well, I've seen more near-run things and people survive them.
People survive them. So you think you might be all right then, are you saying?
No, I've seen closer contests where the winner went on to survive. The question is, how do they bed that down to turn the polls around, so to speak, and from the opposition point of view, it's also a challenge, although I see that they're leading by 10% in the polls. The polls can be very transient.
That was Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters talking to political reporter Joe Moy. It's 6:15. Central North Island towns are mounting a challenge to tougher earthquake strengthening laws. They say threaten their historic main streets with, and I quote, destruction by legislation. Rangitike is leading the way, trying to blaze a trail for rent-poor provincial New Zealand facing a looming deadline where life, safety and economic risks, well, they collide. In recent days, they met the government to push for change. Phil Pennington and cameraman Richard Tindler went to Rangitike and to Manawatu to find out more.
Martin is a town for sale. At the intersection of Broadway and Follett Street, 3 of the 4 buildings are empty. Low rents and high costs to fix earthquake-prone buildings within a 15-year deadline are putting buyers off. That's to say nothing of some existing owners in a town with 70 old buildings. It's according to Mayor Andy Watson.
There's a real collision point here. There are some businesses that are taking the stance, if you like, of we'll see out the 15 years and throw the keys at the council building as we close the shop.
Have they told you that?
There are some businesses that have said that that's what they're faced with.
The Rangitike District Council has bought 3 huge buildings on a corner for $175,000, which could become its new offices, though the rear brick wall does move in the wind. It gets worse for owners, however. The law changes last year impose a 7.5-year deadline in priority public spaces in high-risk zones from Kaikoura to Napier. Rangitike's response is not to introduce a priority zone at all, says Deputy Mayor Nigel Belsham.
After consultation and talking with a number of business owners, that was like tightening the noose around their neck by reducing it down to 7.5 years. So we've given them some breathing space as far as we can under the current legislation and said, look, let's have some time to think about and work forward through the issues.
You're the first council to test that legislation in this way, is that right?
That's correct, yes. And there is a number of councils, I believe, that have looked at what we've done and potentially thinking of following our footsteps.
Now 3 neighbouring councils, Manawatu, Tararua and Whanganui, have joined with Rangitike and met with the Building Minister Jenny Salisa in recent days to push for a slower track for the provinces. But Manawatu needs to know soon if it can afford to delay its public consultation over a priority zone, due in 3 weeks. In Fielding, veteran clothes retailer Kerry Gracie is one who's considering walking away.
Well, I'm the age now where, say, to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on my building without getting a new tenant in, to recoup some of that money, I just can't afford to do that.
Another casualty among the town's 80 or so historic buildings could be the venerable Fielding Hotel, where owner Dave Wiseman says he might simply board it up. But they've bled effort for the town for decades, and giving up goes against the grain.
We can't afford to have our buildings red stickered. We need people in our community. We need them supporting our town. We don't want the scared to come to town. If the issue gets out of hand with the media, that's what can happen. I think it's important to keep some buildings that are heritage, that are worth saving.
Kerry Gracie says another problem is lack of tax exemptions for quake strengthening, and the 4 councils also want that changed. Martin historian John Vickers says the town's once grand post office, built in 1925, shows what's at stake. It's been empty for 30 years, and its broken windows are letting in the pigeons.
Things happen slowly in provincial New Zealand, and we need time, and we'd argue that they're not quite the risk that people think they are in Wellington, perhaps. But yeah, no, we don't need time constraints. But change and interest in them is changing. Upstairs they were all empty, these buildings in the street, but now there's demand for rental accommodation. It's returning to some of these buildings.
Joe Karam is one of those who is interested. The former All Black and champion of David Bain shifted to Martin from Waikato a year ago. He's bought a house and a spread of land for less than a 3-bedroom house in Te Kawhata. Plus, he's converting the old Hodder and Tolly stock agents building into a self-storage business. Joe Karam's hopeful too for the main street.
Council would do well to spend some money keeping those buildings. I think that you'd find tenants, I think you'd find investors and buyers, and the heritage around here is substantial, and it would be a great shame to have things knocked over unnecessarily.
Minister Salisa's office says she's told her officials to work with the councils on what to do next. For Checkpoint, Phil Pennington.
Coming up to 6:21, Maori must lead the change in the criminal justice system. That's the message from the Corrections Minister, Kelvin Davis, who addressed the Criminal Justice Summit this afternoon. Hundreds have packed the Te Raparaha arena in Porirua for the event, which runs until tomorrow night. Our political reporter, Gia Garrick, is there. And Gia filed this report.
What am I meant to do and where am I meant to go? Why does it have to be this way and who am I meant to show? It seems I'm by myself, I'm always hiding, I'm alone. It's of course just a fate and it chills me to my bones. I'm stuck in this concrete cage that seems to be my home. An environment of violence and negativity turns my emotions to stone.
Jacob Leo Skilling wrote this poem while behind bars. He's just one of the ex-prisoners who joined academics, counsellors and chief executives in suits, all taking part in the same breakout sessions at today's Criminal Justice Summit. Sessions named Lived Realities, Aspirations, Reflections, a Call to Action. The Corrections and Crown Māori Relations Minister Kelvin Davis began one of these sessions this afternoon with stories of his childhood.
I've had whānau in prison. I grew up in a street where a number of people living there went to prison. These guys were my mates. I used to build huts with them, swim in the floods, play out in the paddocks together. That's not to excuse their offences, the offences these people have committed, but something has to be done to reduce the scale of this problem and the sheer waste of human potential.
He told the hundreds gathered that while roughly 16% of the country's population is Māori, they make up 51% of the prison population. And it's worse for women. Māori make up nearly 2/3 of women in prison. He again referred to his tribe of Ngāpuhi, saying they're probably the most incarcerated tribe in the world per head of population. But when it comes to exactly what the minister wants to see, it's not exactly clear. For example, will we see a dedicated Māori prison?
There's a massive call for things Māori and Māori-led things to happen in prisons, whether it becomes a whole prison or not. There's a lot of stuff already happening in prisons around Māori tikanga. There's some programs that prisoners have told me are really beneficial.
That's what Kelvin Davis says the summit is for. That's why everybody is packed into these sessions today. Jacob Leo Skilling says he's been in and out of prison and he chose to change because of his daughter. He's now a motivational speaker and was asked to come to the summit by the Ministry of Justice.
It seems to be each generation is getting worse, so if we can start at the next generation now and they make a change in the next generation from that, and from that will follow suit also, and then the change will come, and we'll lessen incarceration numbers, we'll lessen reoffending and recidivist offending, we will lessen all the bad stuff that goes along in our country.
And the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Justice, Andrew Bridgman, says the officials are listening.
We know that the only way to get traction is to listen to those people that have experienced the system and have a view on how the system can change. We're not going to know that by being isolated in Wellington. That will never ever work.
Nationals Justice spokesperson Mark Mitchell agrees Māori have a big role to play if the country is to truly change direction.
I do agree with that. I think that Māori and iwi need to take responsibility in terms of stepping up and saying, yes, we've got big social problems. How can we work with government? How can we work with agencies? How can we work with the broader, wider community to actually make real effective change in these people's lives?
But he's not sure what he refers to as this week's giant counselling session is going to affect that change.
They've got a lot of people here with a lot of knowledge that just have been put into a very untargeted environment where it's very unclear what's actually going to come out the other end of it.
It's an emotive conference, as demonstrated by one man yelling at the Corrections Minister as he left the stage today, asking him why gang members are always the bad guys. From Porirua for Checkpoint, Gia Garrick.
Let's go back to the quake outcast. The government's dumping up $12 million to pay out uninsured Christchurch red zone homeowners more than 7 years after the quakes. 103 property owners will receive the 2007-8 rateable value for their uninsured homes. Dan Dalgetty spoke to property owners after the announcement.
For New Brighton resident Phyllis Thom, it was the news she'd been dreaming about for years.
It's so exciting that we can hardly talk about it. We can now perhaps get a house. This house that we're in now, it's a very nice house to look at, but it needs to be lifted up. It's cracked right through every room, but it's certainly a house that has been earthquake damaged. It means now that perhaps we could maybe get a house or get this house fixed that we could feel a bit more secure in.
Miss Thom was planning to take out home insurance, but they weren't covered when the quake struck. She says a lot of people were caught out by the Canterbury earthquakes.
It was a huge traumatic experience for all of the Christchurch citizens and not just Christchurch, the Canterbury people. So we just thought, well, we're part of it all and, you know, everyone has to pull everything together and kind of your life is precious, so you have to move on and carry on.
However, one person who won't be accepting the government's offer is Bexley resident Ray Francis. She says she has already put a line through it.
We won't be accepting it if it's the 2007 GV valuation. It's 2018, for goodness sake.
Miss Francis says she and her husband couldn't find another property in their price range, even if they tried.
Well, if we had been offered that in 2012, we would have taken it because it was much better. But now we've been looking at houses and we couldn't get anything for what we were offered now.
National's EQC spokesperson Stuart Smith says today's announcement could set a concerning precedent and is unfair to people who did take out insurance. He says there is now a risk that property owners will wait for the Crown to bail them out instead of buying disaster insurance. Minister for Greater Christchurch Regeneration, Megan Woods, says it's up to property owners themselves to decide whether they will accept the offer.
It's voluntary because the residential red zone offers, the original ones, were voluntary too. Look, I'm hopeful that everybody that wants to get on with the new chapter in their life now and wants to have had the opportunity and has been fighting for this in some cases for since 2013, that they will now have that opportunity.
More than 100 homeowners in the red zone areas of Kaiapoi, Karaki, Pines Beach, Brooklands, Avon River, South Shore and the Port Hills have been offered 100% of their property value dating back to 2007-2008. They're set to be paid over the next few weeks. In Ototahi for Checkpoint, called Dan Dalgetty, TNA.
Finally tonight, as New Plymouth residents clean up after yesterday's tornado, Odette Baston is counting herself particularly lucky. Odette told our producer Bridget Burke she'd never been so terrified as the tornado whirled through her neighbourhood and swallowed half her home.
I have no roof. About 80% of the roof is missing. The roof and the ceilings inside are coming down. There's water everywhere. It's bad. It's really bad.
Were you home at the time that the tornado came?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, no, I was sitting doing paperwork and my son turned around and he walked in and he goes, "Mum, the tramp." and the tramp was taking off. My tramp's got a full anchor kit on it, plus steel bars in its feet, and no, it's gone. It's in my courtyard. It just missed my car. And then there was a horrendous bang, and there's a little door on the side of that old chimney that goes into the roof for roof access. It flew open, and I jumped up to grab my lamp and grabbed the door, and as I grabbed the door, I was like, oh my God, that's the sky. And there was literally, I could see right through the roof into the sky. Just went into panic mode, and then the whole room was vibrating, and then there's mess flying everywhere, and then the ceiling sort of started to move, and I was absolutely petrified. This is going to sound stupid, but I've had some unlucky situations. I've been in a house that flooded horrendously up over my knees, and I lost quite a bit then. I've also been in a house that caught fire not once but twice within 4 months. And now this, but that was way more terrifying.
That was Bridget Burke, our producer, talking to Odette Baston in New Plymouth. Must be an unbelievable experience to be home when your home is hit by a tornado. Incredible. So far so good on the weather front tonight. It's not very nice, but no tornadoes as far as we understand. Thank you everyone for being with us. On behalf of the excellent and hard-working Checkpoint team, it's a pleasure to have your company. We hope to see you again tomorrow night at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The Environment Minister David Parker says some feedlots are environmentally unsound and he struggles to see how they can be legal. Extra police are brought in to help hunt down the people who shot dead a 27-year-old man in Whanganui today. Widespread approval throughout the Public Service Association for the end of performance bonuses for the sector's bosses. And Donald Trump fears any discrepancy in his statements to the Mueller investigation may bring perjury charges against him. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Worlds of Music is a world music program with a difference. Every week we present an eclectic mix of world music, fusion and folk roots from all over the planet. The program includes a variety of artists, interviews and musical curiosities.